Major funding for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. And by Sonoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Well, to listen to the increasingly shrill pitch around political rhetoric, especially around candidate Mitt Romney's history with Bain Capital, it would be easy to think that the private equity business is somewhat sinister, calculating, and rawly capitalistic. Welcome again to the most widely watched source of Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William. On this edition, private equity. What is its role in contemporary business, especially since 2008, and just as critical, how has private equity changed the way it deploys capital, raises money, measures the return of investment, and manages in relation to the growing awareness of the social effect that private equity participation has? We have a broad panel of experts that will talk about it, and we will start in just a moment.
Major funding also by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded July 20th, 2012. On this week's program, Rob Edwards of Ridgemont Equity Partners, Mike Elliott of Noro-Moseley Partners, Kel Landis of Plexus Capital, and Adrian Wilson of Square One Ventures. Now, Chris William.
Hello, welcome to our program. Gentlemen, thanks for being here, y'all. Good to have you here. Kel, I'll start with you because you're closest to me. Okay. It seems appropriate. You know, not to make a political statement, it's important to say that we're not making a political statement on this program one way or another, but, you know, it seems during this election cycle that being in the private equity business is a bad thing. I mean, it's almost like, well, Bain Capital, that's a place you don't want to work, when in fact Bain Capital has one of the best reputations on the street. So give us a sense of where private equity is right now in the business cycle as it is, and compare and contrast that to what we're hearing on the streets politically.
Well, I'm not sure I can compare it to Bain. I'm not going to talk about that, but I think here in North Carolina or in the Southeast, I think private equity is actually serving a vital role for small business, which is creating jobs. As we come out of the Great Recession, I know my fund, which is a sub-debt fund, a subordinated debt fund, we're providing growth capital to businesses that they need to grow. And in this credit-constrained environment, I would say private equity and private debt and private capital are in fact a good thing.
Rob, same thing, same question.
We're in the same boat. We're a middle market equity investor and are focused on growth companies. And so whether it's in the Southeast or across the country, we're focused on investing in companies that are expanding. It could be through acquisition, plant expansion. Sometimes it's employment headcount situations, but our capital is being used to grow companies and hopefully benefit the economy as a whole.
You know, and Adrian, I'm not pushing to get a political statement here, but when you hear some of these political campaign ads about Bain Capital and about private equity, does it make you grimace, or do you think, you know, it's a political cycle, it's rhetoric, it'll pass?
Oh, I strongly believe it's rhetoric. At home, when I'm watching the television at night and watching the various ads, regardless of the party, I smile at all of them, because they're taken out of context, and as applied to private equity, I think the ad writers are appealing to emotion versus reason.
Mike?
Yeah, I think it's an easy 30-second, 45-second shot and soundbite. And I do think, particularly now, private equity, what these guys are doing and what I'm doing, and I'm sort of self-serving in this, but in the venture capital business, we're funding some innovation which the United States desperately needs. There's some interesting stats when you back up, and I'll stop with a quick thing. If you look at the private equity-backed companies since 1995 or 6 or something like that, their job growth, those companies have averaged about 80%, or it's been 80% through 2009, whereas the rest of the economy has been somewhere around 12%. And then if I look at my sector, which is venture capital, little bitty companies with technology, we can make the claim as an industry that 20% of today's GDP for the United States comes from companies that were once venture-backed. So there are some problems in private equity, no question about it, but it is a very important piece of our economy.
So when there is all of the rhetoric, and I don't want to keep talking about the political rhetoric, but since we kind of started on that, when there's all this talk and all this rhetoric on programs like this, is private equity at the center? Is it part of the DNA when it comes to jobs, creating jobs? I mean, is that fair to say?
Well, we're licensed by the Small Business Administration, often known as the SBA, and we actually report the number of jobs that our portfolio companies have and create. I think in North Carolina the statistic is over 3,000, and of our other
of venture capital and private equity?
In the subordinated debt space of companies that we have backed to provide growth capital, those companies employ over 3,000 people. In our broader portfolio, that was just North Carolina, the broader portfolio is more like 8,000. And all of our, as we said earlier, all of us are kind of in the growth business. We're funding companies to provide growth, and therefore you know that has to mean adding jobs. If a company's growing, it's adding jobs.
How's the game changed since 2008?
The business remains competitive. There's a lot of capital chasing good growth companies, and so what we found in the last 4 or 5 years is you've got to really be focused on what you're good at, and so that for us has meant our strong industry focus. And so whereas we used to focus on 6 or 8 industries, we're down to 4 industries, and even within those segments or sub-segments, we spend a lot of time, and we try to develop good operating expertise to make sure that we're the right partner for the management team to grow the company going forward. And so I think most firms would say they're a lot more focused in their activities because it is a lot more challenging and competitive in the marketplace.
Does that ring true here at all?
Sure, but the thing I've noticed since 2008 is that a lot of institutional investors have left the asset class. And will they return? Is it cyclical? I think it is. But fundraising has been down, continues to be down. And but I don't know about you guys, I'm seeing a little bit of thawing in the industry. I think investors that have gotten out of the asset class are looking to re-enter it. And it's a good time to do so because there's less money, there's more competition for deals, less competition for deals, and so you can get in cheaper and you've got more upside potential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you agree with that, Mike?
I do, and I would agree with Rob's point. It's interesting. We used to think of strategics as those operating companies, but today many of the firms like Rob's are actually almost strategic in terms of their specific and very deep focus and vertical expertise.
So, I want to come back to this fundraising point that you brought up, Adrian. Is it hard to raise money, Kel?
Well, we haven't talked about the investor side of this. We've talked about the benefits to small business or to companies that grow the economy, but I would say that with most people having the view that there will be a modest growth in the U.S. economy, that will probably have a dampening effect on public markets, public equity markets. And we think that private equity, when you have a really good manager who can pick selective, really good companies with really good management teams, that you can actually outperform the public markets in the private equity space. And that certainly has been true recently, and it's true of our fund. So we work very hard to just be very selective and pick businesses that we think can grow, that have niche products. And you see more and more allocation to alternatives from endowments, foundations, money managers are all allocating more and more to private equity and alternative investments for greater returns than maybe you can get in the public markets. So
the returns and the performance, obviously, of the funds that you put out there are going to attract the fundraising dollars. But I come back to this issue of just raising money. So institutional investors are still not in like they were 5 years ago. Is that fair to say, Adrian?
I think that's fair to say.
Okay, and what is that solely because of the uncertainty around the economy, around what's going to happen? Well, we've got the healthcare thing behind us, but just what is that, Mike? Why do you think that is?
I think in my case, the venture asset class has actually not performed very well. If you look at charts of how much money came into our industry, we're overfunded in the dot-com era, and it's taken about 10 years to wind that down. It's actually a good time now to invest because the number of funds have been cut from 1,000 to maybe 500 active investors. But I think people are starting to warm again to venture. Adrian would know more than me, but I also think that venture is a very tough asset class, and I'm speaking only in venture, and I think a lot of the pension funds are struggling with this liquidity issue that hit them a few years ago.
You know, go ahead, Adrian.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Chris, what's interesting is that you know, while the past 2 quarters have seen an increase in the amount of venture capital monies raised, neither North Carolina nor South Carolina have participated in that. And,
Why do you think that is?
Well, with respect to North Carolina, most of the venture capital dollars raised are in the life sciences and the healthcare sectors. Those are sectors typically that take a greater amount of capital and a longer time to liquidity. And institutional investors at the present time are all about having liquidity. And you know, a drug discovery deal may take hundreds of millions of dollars. It may take 10 to 12 years to get through clinical trials and to commercialization. And investors aren't as patient. You know, venture capital used to be called patient capital, but the investors are no longer as patient as they used to be.
So, but isn't that's the nature of the PE space, private equity space, is the fact that I mean, it's a long lead time. That's never going to change, is it? Will that ever change?
No, I just think you have to be balanced and have an expectation that some realizations will happen sooner, some will happen longer. And therefore, it's the core of what we do is it takes many years to affect the growth strategies we're pursuing. And so that results in a lack of liquidity for a period of time.
You know, you use that term core at what you do, and it seems to me that the core of what you do also is this, it's all connected to the way you take risk, how you look at risk, how you quantify risk, and the risk that you're willing to take on a company that's either new or has a single focus, or is you don't know how it's going to pan out. So I guess this whole issue of risk, and Mike, let me start with you. Private equity, venture capital, angel investors all look at risk a little bit differently than, you know, y'all are kind of different. Let's just say that. Do we need to think in general a little differently on how we incentivize risk in general these days? Does it, and I'm not just talking about private equity. Is it a different metric now?
Well, I do think we almost need a culture that understands there's a place for that risk. Everything we do is not going to be safe. I mean, we're going to have some zeros and some wipeouts. I wish that Noro-Moseley were in Facebook. We weren't. But I think we're going to have, the nature of our business is there will be plenty of our investments that don't make it. That's okay, because we're investing at a stage where for those that do, we can generate an all-in return for our investors. And I think there's a risk continuum across the panelists today that would be different, but I do think we have to sort of accept the fact that there is risk in order to create the innovation we're talking about.
Yeah, and I was going to say it might even be that it flows with how we're sitting here. There is, you know, private equity is used as an umbrella term, but there are all kinds of private capital. There's very early stage and there's venture capital, which these gentlemen do, and they're smarter than me, so they can do that. I'm on the other end of the spectrum, which is private debt. And private debt basically is helping the banks to make better structured loans. So we are very much would be under the umbrella of private equity, but we're really private debt. And there are a lot of sub-debt funds, there are a lot of specialty lenders out there that are in a fund structure. And I think as long as we do business, they grow them and hatch them, and companies like us, like Plexus Capital, we then further their growth with debt.
Rob, Adrian?
And on that spectrum, we're the guy in the middle, so they get the companies past infancy to a meaningful level of revenues, and we provide a lot of the equity to grow the companies even further.
I think what I'm doing here, Adrian, is trying to figure out, over the last 4 years, you know, we've all pulled in everything. Corporations sitting on a lot of cash. People are sitting on a lot of cash. I guess how do we incentivize risk taking again?
Well, I think Mike said it well. I mean, I think it's going to be based upon the actual results of growing innovative companies, and if they're successfully grown, then I think it'll encourage risk taking again. I think the challenge in venture over the past 10 to 12 years now is that risk has not been rewarded, And if you look at it on an industry-wide basis, the industry has basically returned to zero over that period of time. And so, but as we said earlier, we think now is an appropriate time, a good time to put money to work. If so, the rewards will be there, and I think you'll see money's returning to the asset class.
Is it washed people out of the space? Are there private equity guys? You know, it's just
Enough.
It's not going to be like it was.
Sure, the venture market's declined by half, and it needed to decline. It needed to contract, but it's 50% of what it was, you know, a decade ago.
So how do you I guess whether you're doing debt or whether you're doing equity or mezz financing or whatever you're doing, how do you think differently now than you did about it? I mean, what's different about this space now?
Well, I think you got to know that there's a new normal, and so I think we have to.
And maybe not as rich. Is that what you're saying?
Well,
about
yeah, and I think in our space particularly, I think there were some times when leverage was out of hand, where companies were putting too much leverage on their balance sheets. And so we, at least, and I think our whole industry has tried to be a lot more conservative about how much leverage, because it's not a good idea to over-leverage any company. It's not good for the investors, it's not good for the companies, it's not good for the economy. So we try to put a prudent amount of leverage that can help leverage the equity that's in the company, but then have it so it can stress test like through the Great Recession, because we had many companies that did okay during the Great Recession because they were not over-leveraged.
You talk about industry, Rob. Down in your portfolio, you've got some healthcare companies. We're on the other side of the Supreme Court decision now. Is it a lot clearer for those operators? Do they feel much better about it, or where are your group in that?
I think they've. I work in the industrials world, so I'm not the healthcare expert, but I think we're optimistic about the performance of those healthcare companies, but each one of them is positioned differently, and so some will be greater beneficiaries than others. And in fact, I think there's probably more excitement around the potential change versus actually helping the business day to day today. And so what it has done is create a lot of capital kind of coming into the sector, people paying higher valuations with expectation that the growth will continue in the segment, and they hope to benefit from that.
Has the air cleared here?
Well, we've had the occasion to talk to a number of investment bankers who are representing nice companies in the healthcare sector that are for sale, and I think the read we're getting from several of those guys is there's some very high quality companies that are in the market. So there may be some dampening on pricing, I'm not sure, but there are a number of companies that are selling as they've worked through some of the uncertainty and are ready to call it a day. I want to go back to your point. How do we reward risk? I mean, one of the things we did accidentally in the United States was when we changed our capital market system with lots of rules and regulations, some of which definitely needed to be put in place, we kind of overdid it, made it very difficult to have a vibrant IPO market. At the top of the food chain in all of our businesses is a vibrant capital market with IPOs and access to cash, so those companies can buy little companies, those companies can grow. I think we've got to work hard to bring back the regulation, and we've done it. The President's Jobs Act was a nice piece of legislation to help some of these young companies get to the public market. Intel, Microsoft, Computer Associates, companies like that would not be able to go public in the market we live in today, which is amazing to think about.
Do you get, Adrian, you get the sense that there might be an abatement here in this type of headwind from regulatory pressure? Do you agree with Mike in that somewhat?
Well, I do. I mean, example, in the medical device arena, I think the FDA is providing some new regulatory pathways that make it easier for the early stage companies to make progress and to commercialize. And because otherwise, and in other circumstances, I think governmental regulation has had a huge chilling effect, and it is on my business. I mean, my fund is a venture capital fund of funds, and so we build a portfolio of venture capital firms rather than investing in the underlying individual companies. And with the Volcker rule, with some of the new SEC regulations, it's becoming increasingly more expensive and more difficult to do our jobs.
You're a recovering banker, right, Kel?
Yeah.
And I mean, you look at some of these Volcker rules, a perfect example. I mean, are you in fear of more regulation, more compliance?
Well, I'm actually happy about one provision.
Being out of banking?
No, I'm happy about that too. But I'm happy about one provision in Dodd-Frank and the Volcker Rule. SBIC, Small Business Investment Companies, of which we are one, are specifically excluded from restrictions of banks investing in SBICs. And the reason that exclusion was there is because we are providing capital to small business America. So, but I do think that when you think about banks that are FDIC insured, rolling the dice on multi-billions of dollars in their trading operations while there's FDIC insurance covering the depositors, there is some rationale for Mr. Volcker and what he's saying there. But like any regulation, it can be taken too far. And I'm not a banker anymore, thank goodness. And so I'm not real familiar with all of the impacts of that on a bank.
Should the banks and the investment banks be separated again? Should we go back to that?
Well, I think there is that part of what Dodd-Frank was about was to bifurcate that. Yeah. That if these big, investment banks are going to have commercial banks in them and accept deposits and be FDIC insured, that those risks should be separated. And again, I just think there's rationale and logic to that. Yeah. I still think there's a lot of synergies in financial services companies covering the broad spectrum of capital.
Yeah, so how do you take, and I didn't mean to go down this road, but Mike, because you're down there nodding with them when I asked him that question, I guess how do you take the fact of the banks got really good at financial services, but they also got really bad at taking advantage of, as banks will do, or at least investment banks will do, or at least capitalists will do. Should the banks be split again?
Boy, I'm glad Kel's here as the expert, but it sure seems that the old way where insured deposit money is insured, we as taxpayers behind it, that is a different business than trading for your own account with a backstop being the United States government. So I agree. I'm not a big guy on regulation, but we got way out of hand on that. I would be very careful in how that regulation layers itself back in. It's very, very difficult to be a bank these days.
And like most pieces of major legislation, there are unintended consequences. And so while Square One Bank has never traded in such a manner on its own account, I'm an affiliate of Square One Bank, and so I'm subject to regulations that make no sense. And so we hope there'll be some relief as the regulations get drafted and implemented.
Adrian, let me stay with you. We got about 3 minutes left. I want to talk about Duke Progress Energy, and you spent some time on the team at Progress Energy in the legal department and in the operations department. And Kel, you're not going to get out of this either. What happened there? I mean, here we have what seemingly was going to be the merger, at least of the year, if not of this new decade, create a wonderful utility company, and it still might very well happen. Seems like it easily could. But what happened to this thing? Did the merger just go too long? Did the FERC decision just knock them off their feet? What happened?
Well, I think length of time to get approval from the FERC is an issue, but under the best of circumstances, putting together two large organizations with different cultures and different personalities is a challenge. And I think that the struggle, as I understand it through friends at both organizations, that the struggle and the length of time brought frustrations to the table, caused rethinking of the deal. And at the end of the day, it was very difficult to meld those personalities. But that happens with any major merger. And so, Duke and Progress, this is no different. It has gotten a little bit, it has escalated, of course, as we all know. But to me, it's a mixing of the cultures.
And we've got about 45 seconds left. Kel, same thing. I mean, you've been through M&A activity at the bank. You've been acquired. Is this about culture? Is that what this story's about?
Yeah, well, all I can say is kind of related to my career in banking, where I was a product of a merger of equals that created Centura Bank. I was then an acquirer when I was involved in buying about 30 banks during the 90s, and then I became an acquiree when we sold Centura to RBC. And all I know is that culture is very important, and cultural alignment is very difficult and very complicated. And I just hope in this case that it all works out for all these nice people, and works out for the shareholders, and works out for the customers of this new Duke Energy company.
That'll be the last word. No, well said. Gentlemen, thank you for being on the program, and best of luck going forward. It's going to get better. We all feel pretty good about that. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Chris.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching our program. If you have a comment, you have a suggestion, or you'd like to watch any of our past programs online, Easily done. We are at I have to think about this for a second. CarolinaBusinessReview.com. Thank you. CarolinaBusinessReview.com. Until next week, I'm Chris William, and we certainly hope your business and your weekend is good.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant Health, including Presbyterian in Charlotte and Forsyth in Winston-Salem, are affiliate heart hospitals of the Cleveland Clinic, consistently ranked #1 in the nation for heart care. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, proudly serving South Carolinians since 1946. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit CarolinaBusinessReview.com.